No one in the Dupree family expected that what seemed like an ordinary private meeting would explode into the most devastating scandal in their history. With a single secret dragged into the light, every layer of elegance, reputation, and moral facade they had spent years constructing shattered instantly like brittle glass. It was a direct blow to the heart of the entire system, unleashing betrayal, fury, and a wave of horror none of them were prepared to face. The question was no longer what they had tried to hide, but how much they were about to pay for living with the truth that had just been exposed. June felt the air thicken around her the moment the truth left her mind and solidified into intention. For months she had lived with the secret like a stone lodged deep in her throat, poisoning every breath, staining every moment she spent inside the immaculate walls of the Dupree estate. She had watched the family parade around with practiced grace, the illusion of unity shimmering like polished glass, fragile and brittle beneath the weight of everything unsaid. And at the center of it all was Martin, whose charm and calculated authority had shielded him from suspicion for years. He had taught her what silence could cost, and now it was time for him to understand that not all debts could be buried. As she entered the private chamber reserved for family matters, June felt eyes track her movement, measuring her presence, trying to decipher whether she was an ally or a threat. She had once tried to be both, balancing loyalty and self-preservation in a way that left her internally shredded. But today she no longer felt torn. The truth had chosen her long before she had chosen it. She stood still for a moment, sensing the undercurrent of tension tightening with every heartbeat. She sensed Danny's restlessness, her habit of clenching and unclenching her fists when she sensed danger. She registered Anita's poised stillness masking a simmering unease. She always sensed disruption before anyone else, like a veteran reading shifts in the wind before a storm broke against the shore. Vernon, stoic and grave, observed June with weary disappointment, assuming perhaps that she was here to stir yet another conflict he had no energy left to mediate. And somewhere behind them, hidden in the folds of the family's collective shadow, Martin waited with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the past could not touch him. June exhaled once, lightly, as if releasing the last tether holding her to caution. And then she let the truth unfold. The revelation did not land as a single blow, it hit in waves. The knowledge that two children long believed to be unrelated adoptees, brought into the family under a veil of goodwill, were in fact Martin's biological offspring, conceived through a hidden relationship he had spent years erasing, detonated through the room with an almost physical force. The secret carved itself into the space between every family member, rearranging their understanding of him, of themselves, of the structure that had allowed the lie to thrive. Anita's face went cold first, the shock hardening into something sharp and unyielding. She had spent decades cultivating an unshakable authority, but June watched fractures race through that facade, revealing the tremor of betrayal underneath. Anita had sacrificed too much to maintain order in this family, had carried the burden of righteousness through scandals, disappointments, and pressures no one else had the fortitude to endure. The revelation did not simply expose Martin. It unmade years of her moral certainty. June saw the fury coil within her like a living creature, kept barely contained by the elegance of her posture. Danny, on the other hand, reacted like a spark thrown into dry grass. Her anger ignited instantly, scorching every ounce of restraint she possessed. She had always been the emotional heartbeat of the family, the one whose impulses exposed what others worked to hide. But this betrayal cut deeper than anything she could contain. Her mind raced through memories of her father's lectures on loyalty, his demands for transparency, his insistence on moral superiority. Every hypocritical word now felt like a blade twisting in her chest. Danny's inner conflict spiraled rapidly, torn between her instinct to confront, her need to protect her siblings, and her dread of what this truth meant for the family's legacy. Her breathing quickened, her expression tightened, and she seemed to teeter at the edge of an emotional precipice. Vernon absorbed the truth more slowly, but the devastation was no less severe. His sense of integrity had always been his anchor, the quiet foundation on which the Dupree family balanced. Martin's secret did more than damage trust, it uprooted the values he had carried like a shield for decades. He felt something inside him sink, a heavy resignation settling into his bones as he realized how long he had allowed himself to believe in an illusion. His disappointment radiated outward, hollowing the room with its weight. The anger that followed was quieter, but more dangerous, because it came wrapped in heartbreak. And Martin, when the truth finally pierced him, stood frozen for a moment too long, the brief paralysis betraying his guilt. His internal battle unfolded with excruciating complexity. There was shame, of course, and fear of losing the image he had constructed with painstaking precision. But beneath those immediate emotions lay something darker, resentment. He resented June for exposing what he had convinced himself was justified secrecy. He resented the circumstances that forced his hand years ago, and he resented the family members now staring at him with a mixture of disgust and disbelief, as if they had never benefited from his ability to control the narrative. His mind searched desperately for ways to regain power. Ways to reinterpret the truth, to twist it, to weaponize the vulnerability the revelation created. But none of his internal strategies found traction. The truth stood too stark, too raw, too undeniable. The aftermath unfolded like a slow, inevitable unraveling. Anita turned inward first, withdrawing from the collective tension to examine the personal cost. She thought of every compromise she had made for the sake of appearances, every time she had chosen duty over desire, every moment she had upheld the boundaries of marriage with silent pride. She felt foolish, betrayed, exposed. Her anger became a calculation, a shift in the power dynamics of the household. She began to consider which alliances would hold and which would break, who would stand with her, and what she needed to reclaim control. The betrayal did not weaken her. It hardened her resolve, sharpening her instincts into something cold and deliberate. Danny spiraled into a different kind of turmoil. For her, the betrayal resurrected old wounds she had buried beneath ambition and intensity. She had always feared that her father valued control over connection, and now her suspicions solidified into truth. Her thoughts grew chaotic, fueled by a growing sense of displacement. If Martin could lie about something so monumental, what else in their family history was built on deception? She began to question her own identity, her place in the lineage, and whether her pursuit of acceptance within the family had been in vain all along. The more she thought, the more her anger metastasized into recklessness, pushing her toward destructive impulses that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Vernon, though quieter, felt the deepest internal rupture. He had served as the emotional compass of the family, believing that honesty could mend even the worst mistakes. Now he found himself trapped between loyalty and truth, between the desire to preserve the family and the need to confront the rot creeping through its foundations. His internal conflict grew heavier with each passing minute, the pressure building until he feared that any attempt to speak would bring the entire legacy crashing down. He felt responsible for keeping the family intact, yet powerless to stop it from splintering. Martin's mind churned with tangled rationalizations. He viewed himself simultaneously as the victim and the architect of his downfall. His ego clawed for justification, for some explanation that would absolve him, but every defense sounded hollow even in the privacy of his thoughts. He felt trapped, cornered by the consequences he once believed he could outrun. And yet, instead of remorse blossoming into accountability, something more corrosive took root: defiance. He refused to accept the image of himself reflected in the family's horrified expressions. The more they judged him, the more determined he became to reclaim authority, even if it required tearing apart the trust that once protected him. June observed the chaos with a mixture of relief and dread. She had not expected the truth to heal anything, but she had hoped it might free her from the loneliness of knowing. Instead, she felt the weight shift, as if the secrecy had simply reshaped itself into a new burden she now shared with everyone in the room. The guilt of being the catalyst gnawed at her, even though she knew the fault lay elsewhere. Her mind flickered through memories of the children. Innocent, unaware of the circumstances of their birth, carrying no responsibility for the damage their existence now exposed. She feared for them, for what the family might do with this information, for the storm of resentment and confusion they would soon face. Her decision had been necessary, but its consequences loomed like a tidal wave. As the hours stretched on, the silence between family members grew more suffocating. Every gesture felt loaded, every glance sharpened by suspicion or anger. The estate, once a symbol of power and unity, began to feel like a pressure chamber, compressing emotions into volatile fragments. Each person's inner turmoil fed the others, creating a cycle of escalating tension with no clear release. The family had been pushed to the edge, and now they stood suspended in the space between collapse and retaliation. Anita began to isolate herself, building fortresses of strategy and resolve in her mind. She envisioned futures where she no longer tolerated Martin's interference, futures where she reclaimed authority with an iron grip. Her anger became the blueprint for a transformation she could no longer ignore. Danny drifted dangerously close to self-destruction. Her impulses grew sharper, her actions more unpredictable as she sought outlets for her rage. She felt abandoned by the people she trusted most and suffocated by the realization that she had never truly understood the foundations of her own family. Vernon fell into a quiet despair, grappling with the burden of choosing between truth and peace. Every path seemed laced with consequences he could not accept, and each choice threatened to pull him deeper into emotional paralysis. Martin retreated into a warped sense of victimhood. The pressure to maintain control drove him to contemplate decisions he might have once considered unthinkable. His need to preserve his reputation, to regain power, to punish those who had exposed him, darkened his thoughts until the line between justification and malice began to dissolve. And June, now irrevocably tied to the conflict she had ignited, found herself standing at the threshold of a transformation she had not prepared for. The truth had freed her from silence, but it had also bound her to the fallout, making her a witness, and perhaps a participant, in the family's unraveling. The Dupree estate, once a monument to prestige and legacy, now felt like a battlefield waiting for the first strike. Each member of the family stood cornered by their own emotions, pushed to the edge by betrayal, anger, guilt, and fear. Their reactions simmered beneath the surface, ready to erupt into choices that would scar them all.